Hey everybody, well it is a rare rainy day here in Santa Barbara and I've been inside all day editing, and it got me thinking that I hadn't made an editing video for YouTube in a long time. My editing has changed so much this year. I've spent so much time just meticulously tweaking and thinking about editing and trying to land on something that really felt like me, that I was really satisfied with. Editing is so important to this craft, and particularly for me as a wedding photographer. My goal was to create something timeless but also artistic and beautiful and unique. That's a lot of adjectives to throw together to make a style that's cohesive. So it's been challenging, but I've learned a ton this year and I feel like I'm on track. And the thing that I learn that I think is consistent with other artists and photographers is that editing is sort of always evolving and changing, and so you never really land anywhere, but you grow every year as you learn more about yourself as an artist, as you change. Art is constantly changing. So I think it's okay to give ourselves some slack when we think about our journey in editing. In a moment, we're going to dive into Lightroom and I'm going to actually edit some photos before you. But before we get there, just want to talk a little bit more about my thinking about editing right now. So for the past year or so, I've been using the Archetype Process film emulation profiles. I have a couple of videos about these profiles on the channel. The tap profiles are a really great tool if you're trying to emulate film. I really love these. As I mentioned in previous videos, they can feel a little bit overwhelming at first, and understanding how to use them can be kind of difficult, but they do have a Facebook group and there are other videos on YouTube that can kind of help you in that regard. Tap is really, really amazing for finding a timeless editing style that is reminiscent of film, which is very popular these days. Another company that I've really enjoyed recently is Goodlight. They make similar profiles that are really excellent that also mimic film. But there's another company called DVLOP that makes presets. I've purchased a few packs from them, including Eric Floberg's and Nirav Patel's. But recently they put out a pack by Kristen Marie Parker called Day to Day, and it sort of was this timeless, true to life, filmy kind of preset that really caught my attention. I have to say I really, really love it. It's a lot of what I like about the tap profiles, but it's sort of in the preset itself. I also like that this preset pack is a one preset pack. There's one color and one black and white. The black and white for me isn't really my favorite black and white, I have to be honest, but the color preset is really amazing. And I also appreciate the tools that are included in this preset. DVLOP also includes their own profiles. So this preset is really unique and it's sort of unlike other presets. And I have to say, I have purchased packs from DVLOP in the past and I've enjoyed experimenting with them, but I haven't really used them and probably wouldn't use them in my work because they just required a bit more work to get the photos where I wanted them to be, etc. But with this day-to-day preset from Kristen Marie Parker and DVLOP, it's almost like you apply it and the photos are ready to go. I mean, there's always tweaks when it comes to using presets, but this one gets it really close right off the bat. Like I said, nothing is ever set in stone. Different collections of images might call for different presets or different profiles, but I do think it's important to have a really solid understanding of your style and your artistic preferences so that your work will look consistent, because ultimately we want our work to look consistent. Consistency is something that is really, really valuable and allows us to sell our photography at really high prices because you can market yourself with a body of work that is all consistent. So clients, when they're booking you, know exactly what they are buying. Okay, so that's a lot of talking. Let's dive into Lightroom and let's edit some files. All right, so here we are back in Lightroom. I put together a collection of 20 images from a wedding I second shot a couple years ago. You've probably seen some of these images before because I know I feature them on the channel, but I really, really love this gallery because it was a stunning wedding in one of my favorite venues, and we have a lot of different lighting scenarios that we can work with when using this preset. So let's go ahead and start at the beginning. Here's a sort of classic detail shot, all the details. So let's go ahead and I'm going to click D to get to the develop module. And so you can see over here, I have all the presets that I'm currently using. So as I mentioned, I have some good light presets. I have some tap presets. These are presets that I've made that use these profiles. And then I also have tap monochrome because these are my preferred black and whites at the moment. Then we have some tools that I've made. It's just grain. ZM Performances is for performance work, so we can close that out. And then here we have the preset from DVLOP, Kristen Marie Parker Day-to-Day Collection. So if we go ahead and apply the preset, here's what it looks like. So that's a before and that's an after. So immediately you can tell that this preset is very true to life, which I love. I want my work to feel true to life. I don't want it to feel edited, but I want it to feel elevated. That's always the goal. In this preset pack, we have some modifications. We can make the greens more blue. We can make the greens more yellow. Smooth skin, skin tone shift to pink. This sort of helps with skin tone if we need. Dehaze backlight blend. You can see what that's doing there. Reduce noise extra. Lens corrections on or off. We also have a level. I think I might just drop the blacks here and raise the overall exposure. One thing about this preset is it does lift the blacks quite a bit. So if you're not a fan of that, you can always drop them. I'm bringing down the highlights to bring back some detail. I'm going to bring up the exposure a little more, bring down the whites a little bit. That's a before and that's an after. I might just also make this a little bit cooler. Let's look at a before and after. That looks great. We're going to move on to the next image. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and copy the settings from the previous photo onto this one by clicking previous. And this looks pretty good. I think it's a little bit too contrasty. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just kind of reset these sliders in the basic panel. I might bring up those shadows again. Might bring down the overall exposure. We can sort of gauge what's happening by doing a before and after. I'm just hitting the backslash key. So here's a before, here's an after. Bring down the exposure a little bit more and bring up the shadows a little more. Before, after, before, after. Yeah, so this looks really great to me. It's stylized, it looks kind of filmy, but still true to life. Really love that. Okay, here's another one of the groom waiting to see his bride. And we're gonna go ahead and apply day-to-day color. So you can see right off the bat, this makes a really beautiful look. It's just a little bit of pop, a little bit of interest, interesting color here. I'm gonna go ahead and make the greens more blue by clicking this preset. And I'm gonna bring down the highlights. I may bring down the blacks, bring them back a little bit and bring up the shadows. I might bring down the overall exposure. So this is a before, this is an after. It's looking great. I think we might make this slightly more pink and slightly cooler. Before, after, before, after. And I think that looks brilliant. We're gonna move on to the next image. Let's apply day-to-day. And we're gonna go ahead and bring down the highlights and bring up the shadows. I'm gonna bring down the blacks. I'm gonna go ahead and crop this image to a 4:3 ratio. I've really been enjoying 4:3 recently. Let's zoom in a little to our subject. Before, after, before, after. That looks pretty good. So for this image, I'm gonna go ahead and copy the settings from this image. So I'm gonna check all except for transform, healing, crop, masking. I'm gonna copy everything else and I'm gonna come to this image and I'm gonna apply. And that already looks really good. I'm gonna bring back the exposure and I might just crop this image a little bit. That's a before, after, after. The highlights are a little too crushed for me, so I'm gonna bring them back. Before, after. Beautiful, let's move on. So I'm gonna go ahead and do the same thing and apply the settings that I copied, and that looks pretty great. I'm gonna bring back the highlights. I'm gonna bring back the exposure a little bit. Before, after. So you can see this preset has a pretty strong effect on this bridesmaid's dress. So it's turning this sort of reddish dress orange. It's not really affecting the other colors as heavily. So in order to combat that, we can do a couple of things. I think what I might do is go into our color mixer and select this color. So I don't want it to affect the skin tones. I only really want it to affect the dress. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna shift this hue back towards the original color. Bring down the saturation slightly. Okay. And we can see what that's doing. It just is bringing this dress back closer to the original color. And I think that that looks quite nice. So here's a before, after, before, after. I might bring down the highlights. This looks pretty good. All right, here's the exterior of these greenhouses at the Dos Pueblos Orchid Farm here in Goleta. I'm gonna go ahead and apply our base preset, and you can see right off the bat what this does. Before, after, before, after. I'm gonna bring down the highlights, bring down the blacks slightly. I might just bring up the shadows a little bit. This to me looks really good. I'm gonna go ahead and make the greens more blue, and that looks great. Before, after, before, after. We're gonna go ahead and say previous to apply the same settings. I'm gonna bring up the overall exposure here, bring down the highlights and the whites, before, after. I might bring down the exposure, before, after, before, after. I might bring this a little bit cooler. There you go, beautiful. I'm gonna copy the settings from the previous image onto this one. I'm gonna bring down the exposure. I'm gonna bring back our white balance to what it originally was. And I'm just gonna even out these basic adjustments. I might bring down the overall exposure, before, after, before, after. We're gonna go ahead and copy those same settings from the previous image. I'm gonna bring up the overall exposure and down the highlights and bring this down a little bit more. Before, after, before, after. We're going to go ahead and apply the same settings from the previous image. Bring down the overall exposure. There we go. Wonderful. Before, after, before, after. I'm going to apply the settings from the previous image to this one. I'm going to bring down the overall exposure, bring up the shadows and down the blacks. We're going to warm this up a little bit. Before, after. That looks pretty great. We're going to go ahead and apply day-to-day, and I'm going to bring up the overall exposure. I'm going to bring down the blacks so we have more contrast. I'm going to bring up the shadows and bring the highlights down. I might bring back that original exposure. Before, after, before, after. We're going to apply the settings from the previous image to this one, and I might also adjust the cropping. There we go. Before, after, before, after. Beautiful. So you can see I'm doing a lot of the same type of things as we edit these images. It's kind of all the same. And this is a combination of, my taste using this preset. This is just sort of how I've edited it. And typically we're just using the basic panel here. So it's a lot of just exposure, contrast, and white balance to get the final look. So that's what I love about this preset is it's really, really easy to get to the final look. That's something that is so valuable when it comes to presets. We're going to go ahead and apply the settings from the previous image to this one. Bring up the exposure. Looks pretty good. Going to apply the previous settings to this image. Might bring up the exposure and down the highlights and whites. Great. Let's go ahead and apply day-to-day to this one. I'm gonna go into white balance and say auto and see what happens. So that's pretty close. I will sometimes do this if we have an image where the white balance was off when I shot it. If you're shooting to raw files, we don't have any problem changing the white balance in post. So we can always dial it in post. I do like nailing it in camera if I can, but if we can't, we can fix it here. So this doesn't always work, but like I said, I did click on auto white balance and it did a pretty good job. So here's a before and an after, before, after. This is with the preset applied and it looks really nice. I'm gonna bring up the highlights. I might drop the blacks a little. I might drop the highlights a little and maybe bring up the overall exposure. but that looks pretty good. We're going to apply the same settings onto this image as well. And again, it looks really good. This was a similar photo, so they apply really well. And now this one, we're going to apply the previous settings to this one. We're going to really raise the exposure here and bring down the highlights and the whites. The auto white balance isn't really working in this one, so I'm going to go back to as shot. So that looks a little bit better. I might cool it off slightly. Maybe slightly more green, maybe warm it back up. There. That looks pretty nice to me. Okay, great. So we've edited these files, but it doesn't stop there. I need to export them and finalize them for delivery now. There's a final step to my editing that's changed a little bit, and that is adding grain. So I've been using the grain from the archetype process. They have this really beautiful film grain, and like their profiles, there are plenty of options for different film stocks where you can really dial in the type of grain that you want. And the cool thing about this grain is it looks more like film than the grain that you would get out of Lightroom. So the way that this works is you have to export the images from Lightroom. They go into Photoshop where the grain is applied, and then they go back into the export folder. It's kind of a confusing process at the beginning, but once you set it up, it's really pretty easy. So let me show you how to export these images, and I'll show you what they look like after the grain's been applied, and then we can save the whole process of how to get this and use this for another video. Diving back into Lightroom, I'm gonna go ahead and select all these images. So imagine these images are in a gallery that's ready to be delivered to a client. I'm gonna say Shift-Command-E to bring up my export dialog. And you can see over on the left-hand side, I have some presets for the tap grain export settings. So the one that I've been using is the 3600 short edge monochrome. So this is a preset that I've made for exporting images. And I'm going to go ahead and say batch export. I'm going to choose my folder. In this case, they're going to go into a folder on my YouTube drive called images. We're going to go ahead and choose, and then we're going to export the file. So these images are now being exported into that folder. They're going to then automatically be transported to Photoshop where the grain is going to be applied, and then they're going to continue to live in the folder. The thing that's cool about the tap grain is after you set it up, you can export batches of images from Lightroom, and it's essentially the same as exporting them from Lightroom normally. There's just this extra step that's automatic because you already set up the process beforehand. So I just export all these images, and essentially they just go into a folder, into Photoshop, back into that folder without me having to do anything. So it's a really easy process once it's set up. And here are the images here in the folder. These are the exported images with the grain applied. So we're going to go ahead and look through these. And if you can see, here the images have been exported and we can see the grain. I'm not sure if you can see it on YouTube. I don't want the grain to feel extra obvious. I want it to feel present. I want it to make the images feel artistic. I want them to feel like film, but I don't want the grain to be overpowering, and that's exactly what this grain does. It's grain that actually feels like film grain, which is pretty cool. So there you have it, the day-to-day preset from DVLOP and Kristen Marie Parker. This one is really, really great. It feels filmy. It feels true to life. It's a preset that I've really enjoyed using, and it's definitely one that I think will stay in my little lineup of presets for my own work. Let me know what you think about this preset. What do you think about the images? Have you used it? Are you planning to? Do you have questions? Leave them down below. If you're new here, consider subscribing to the channel. I'd love to see you at the next video. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. That really helps me out. It's just an easy little click of a button, really helps the channel, and I really appreciate it. Thank you as always for watching, and I'll see you soon. Bye.